Well, hello everybody and welcome to ARTRAVESTY. Now that we have seen the end of the world Christian style, as in The Last Judgment by Giotto and by Michelangelo, we are going to look at the beginning of the world Christian style, or rather the beginning of the Christian world. And for that we are going to go back to the north of Italy, this time to the city of Milan and to its brilliant Brera gallery, where lives a beautiful painting by Raphael. It's called The Marriage of the Virgin. It was a very popular theme and many painters painted it, but Raphael's version is the most famous, so we're using that. And here is Mary in the center as she is being betrothed to the elderly Joseph. It's actually the betrothal of Mary rather than the marriage of Mary, because at the time the Hebrew tradition dictated that 3 months must elapse between the betrothal and the actual nuptials, where Mary would go to Joseph's house. Until then she would have to stay put. Well, again, a lot of things can happen in 3 months. And well, now we'll leave the Bible, the biblical account, which actually doesn't account for much when Mary is concerned, and we are going to go to the so-called Golden Legend that was written sometime in the Middle Ages, and it has much to say about Mary. And according to the Golden Legend, Mary was not just a little girl from some dusty, God-forsaken little village. No, Mary was privileged.
Not only Hungarian, but of royal blood. She is a princess. Her blood, he said, is bluer than the Danube is or ever was. Royalty is absolutely written on her face. She thought that I was taken in, but actually I never was. How could she deceive another member of her race?
And as a privileged girl, she was one of the consecrated virgins of the temple, which is why Raphael is painting the Jerusalem temple in the background. Well, since there was no chance that Raphael could know what the Jerusalem temple actually looked like in the year 0, he improvised. And so Mary was one of the temple virgins. And again, according to tradition, these girls they lived at the temple and they studied at the temple, they were given education. But once they reached puberty, or approximately the age of 14, well, then it was decided that they needed to start producing the next generation. Mary was different, however. She was special, even among these privileged girls. And she couldn't just be betrothed to anybody. In the first place, the man had to be the descendant of King David. But, well, that wasn't really that difficult, because King David, who lived approximately 1,000 years earlier, was a very enthusiastic fellow in many respects, but certainly where women were concerned. And then he happened to have a son by the name of Solomon. And the Old Testament tells us that this King Solomon had a harem. And in that harem lived 700 wives and 300 concubines. And King Solomon was king for 40 years, so you can imagine what went on in that harem of 1,000 women for 40 years. There was a lot of progeny, and the king probably started before he even became king. And now over 1,000 years, all that progeny sired more and more progeny. I wouldn't be surprised if the entire kingdom of Israel were populated by the descendants of King David, and probably the neighboring kingdoms as well. And so so many young and not so young men showed up to make themselves useful that the high priest had to announce a contest. Each man was asked to bring his rod. No, not that rod, that came naturally with them. A wooden rod. Each man was asked to bring a wooden rod. And whichever rod bloomed its owner would be the chosen. So apparently the high priest did not imagine the possibility of several rods blooming at the same time. It's my dick in a box. And well, they didn't. Only one did. But why this particular rod that bloomed had to belong to the elderly Joseph as opposed to some energetic, vigorous young men of whom there were aplenty, that's anybody's guess. And Joseph was 3 times Mary's age. Mary was 14, Joseph was supposed to be 40 plus, which for the time was a very, very old age. Other painters, Signorelli for instance, paints him at least 60 if not more, and the same with Ghirlandaio. Raphael was very nice to him. He actually paints him nice and elegant and lovely, but then Raphael himself, according to everything we know about him, was nice and elegant and lovely. But as I said, 40 plus was old for the time. And yet Joseph became the winner. But then the Golden Legend also doesn't forget the young men and talks about them and about their great frustration and how in their great frustration many just broke the rod. And you see it in different versions again. The Signorelli version shows at least 2 of them breaking the rod, and in the Ghirlandaio version at least 1 is breaking the rod, the other one is kind of shaking his fist above Joseph's head. Raphael makes 1 man break the rod, sort of cumulatively expressing the frustration of all. Well, but now whenever you see the so-called marriage of the Virgin, the painting, or rather the betrothal of the Virgin, do look for this efflorescence or the budding of the rod, and do sympathize with these unfortunate young men whose, well, rods proved to be so disappointing. They too found out, to their chagrin, that the truth is found under the tree, or, well, perhaps at the end of a branch.